Hello everyone, this is Miss K. I hope you are doing well. Today we are going to go over 10-2 Energy and Nutrients. This is for May 11th A Day or May 12th B Day. Today we're going to hopefully have a shorter lecture ed puzzle thing followed by an interactive lab. So let's get started. So this image kind of shows something that I've brought up to you guys several times throughout the year. If I were to hold a plant in my hand and it's got the soil it needs, what else does it need to grow? And hopefully you're thinking, well, Miss K, it would need sunlight for energy, it would need water, and then it would need air containing carbon dioxide. Then what would come out of this equation would then be sugar for the plant to use later to then convert into energy, and oxygen as a byproduct that we as humans and oxygen-breathing animals will happily use. So now the next thing I want you to think of is, would this plant in my hand be a consumer, a producer, or a decomposer? Think about what each of those words kind of mean, and we'll go into more detail on them in the next few slides. So before we go over things like producer, consumer, decomposer, I want you to think back to Unit 5. Let's do a little bit of review there so that will help with the rest of this lesson. In Unit 5, we went over metabolism, so things like photosynthesis and respiration. So when we're talking about photosynthesis, I hope the term autotroph rings bells, right? Auto meaning self and troph meaning nourished from, so things like plants, some bacteria, the things that can produce their own energy. Autotrophs create their own food, which is then converted into usable energy. So plants, for example, use photosynthesis. They use their little organelles called chloroplasts to make sugar. So the plant takes in sunlight, water, carbon dioxide for the atmosphere, and it goes through a chemical reaction, then producing sugar, C6H12O6, and oxygen as a byproduct. That sugar, though, isn't really usable energy. Something needs to happen. So that sugar is then taken to the mitochondria where respiration takes place. That respiration takes in the C6H12O6 along with oxygen that we breathe in, and the chemical reaction takes place, and what comes out of that is ATP, which is usable energy. Water and CO2 are breathing byproduct. Okay? Then we've got heterotroph, and heterotroph meaning different, nourished from. So heterotrophs consume other sources, and they can't make their own food or energy. So a heterotroph must eat an autotroph, or heterotrophs must eat other heterotrophs. So now we get to talk about producers. Think about the term producer. What does it mean? Okay, now that you're thinking about what the definition of producer means, do you think that that is a autotroph, something that makes its own energy, or a heterotroph, something that needs to consume something else for energy? Take a minute or a second there. Well, a producer is an autotroph. It makes its own energy. So if you look at the little image on the bottom left, you see a happy little sunflower. It's taking in energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and water from the soil. It's then going to go through a chemical reaction where it creates sugar for itself to later be converted into energy, and oxygen as a byproduct. So you know that story. However, not all areas of the planet have access to the sun. So in the bottom right image is mussels on the sea floor. They don't have sun there. So I want you to take a moment and look at this image and figure out, what is this species getting to replace sunlight? What is it using for energy to later convert into sugar? So now we're moving on to consumers. Again, think of what the term consumer means. Now think about, are consumers autotrophs or heterotrophs? Hopefully you're thinking, well, they're heterotrophs. They're consuming other organisms for its own energy requirements. So on the bottom right is an image that kind of shows like an energy pyramid. So the producers are on the bottom, then herbivores are above that, and above the herbivores are omnivores and carnivores, so things that eat plants and animals or just animals, and then above that is like apex predators, just carnivores. They eat all the animals below it. So now I want you to imagine a rotting log. Is the rotting log alive? Hopefully you said no. It's a tree. It died. Now it's a rotting log. All right, but organisms still consume it and break it down. So based on our last lecture, are those organisms that break down the dead rotting log predators? Hopefully you said no, because predation is eating other live things for energy. So again, no, not predators. But do the organisms breaking down the log make their own energy? Do they photosynthesize? Also no. So what are these things that aren't considered autotrophs or photosynthesizers, and what are these things that aren't considered predators, that are not consuming live things for their energy? Well, decomposers. Well, decomposers are organisms that break down dead or decaying matter. They're heterotrophs because they still consume another organism. However, that organism is not alive. If it were alive, that would make them predators, but they're not because they're eating dead material. Well, the image below shows a rotting log, and the time progression goes from left to right. So when a tree first dies, it still has all of its bark on it. Its wood is still strong and sturdy, so it needs larger, sturdier decomposers to start breaking those nice, sturdy pieces apart. As time progresses, you start seeing smaller and kind of softer decomposers come in to break down the smaller and softer pieces of, the decaying tree and wood. And then eventually we get to a part where, the tree is basically no longer existing anymore because it's been broken down into such small particles that its energy has now been reduced to just the minerals that can be recycled and used later. So in order for there to even be producers or decomposers or consumers, there needs to be certain elements and minerals in various abundances. Okay, we know that plants need carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, but we also know that plants need certain kinds of fertilizers or minerals like nitrate, phosphate, potassium. You'll often see NPK written on fertilizer bags. Those stand for those elements. Well, they also need other trace minerals in order to grow and provide energy for the heterotrophs. So if one of those isn't in a high enough abundance, like say potassium, then the organism won't be able to grow as much, or the population won't be able to grow as much, making that potassium a limiting factor. Okay? A limiting factor is an environmental feature or resource that limits the growth, abundance, or distribution of an organism or a population of organisms within an ecosystem. Kind of a mouthful, but let's go into more detail. Limiting factors can be found in abiotic, non-living, and biotic, living ways. So some examples of abiotic would be light, space, minerals, catastrophic climate events, shelter, things like that. Then biotic could be the amount of predators, or the amount of prey, or competition for a certain common prey item. Things like parasites and diseases. Those can be examples of biotic limiting factors. If you look to the image to the left, this is a barrel, and it could be filled to full capacity. But there are some boards that are messed up, and those messed up boards represent limiting factors. The barrel can only be filled to the shortest board, okay, because it's going to spill out at that shortest board. So in this scenario, which one is the limiting factor? So now I want you to imagine we have a rabbit, fox, and grass. And I want you to think of what eats what in this scenario. Take a second to pause this video or just think about it. But in this scenario, hopefully you thought of something like this. Well, the grass gets eaten by the rabbit, and the rabbit gets eaten by the fox. The arrows point in the direction of the one doing the eating, and this makes sense because it shows the direction of the energy flow. So by putting them in order, the grass gets eaten by the rabbit and the rabbit gets eaten by the fox, you've basically created your first simple food chain. Yay! Food chains. Food chain is a simplified hierarchical system that describes the transfer of energy from organism to organism. So if you look at the image to the right, you see our primary producers taking energy from the sun, getting eaten by primary consumers, things like shrimp. Then those shrimp are being eaten by a secondary consumer, small fish. Those small fish are eaten by tertiary consumers like tuna. And then eventually the apex predator, the great white shark, goes and tears apart the tuna to get its own energy. Okay? Nice, simple, linear. However, nature is complicated. The single linear path of a food chain doesn't really show the whole picture on how all biotic and abiotic factors work together. This will actually look something like this. So arrows going everywhere in every direction, right? So it's not as simple as the kelp gets eaten by the sea urchin gets eaten by the sea otter gets eaten by the orca. Okay, sometimes those arrows go in various different directions, like the orca can die and be eaten by the sea cucumber, and then something might eat the sea cucumber, and then, you know, it's a complicated circle of life thingy, but let's take a step back and go over some terminology before we really get into this more complicated picture. So trophic levels. Trophic level is a position an organism occupies within a food chain or a food web. So the very base of the trophic level, the biggest, most broadest, is autotrophs. They're at the base. They bring energy to the community. So they, through photosynthesis, take energy from the sun and convert it into usable energy for themselves and anything that eats them. Then on top of that is various heterotrophs that feed at higher levels. Herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. All right. So here we have an image that depicts trophic levels. So on the very bottom of this little pyramid, the sturdiest base part is level 1, and that's primary producers. So these are our plants and photosynthesizing bacteria and algae and things like that that uses photosynthesis to create energy for everything else. These are considered autotrophs. Then we have level 2, primary consumers, herbivores. So these are the guys that eat the plants. They are considered heterotrophs. We have level 3, secondary consumers. So this consists of carnivores that just eat the animals below them, or omnivores that eat the animals below them and sometimes the plants below that. And these guys are considered heterotrophs. And then we have the 4th level, which is tertiary consumers. They're top carnivores, they're heterotrophs. All they do is eat the organisms, the non-plant organisms that are below. And then we have level 5, apex consumer or the apex predator. So these guys have no natural predators, especially if you take out humans from the equation because we cheat with weapons and stuff. They can greatly affect the food chain or food web. So in this system, the peregrine falcon is the apex predator. It can eat all of the animals below it, and it can greatly affect how this ecosystem works. An example of apex consumer could maybe be an African elephant. It's not a predator, but still it can have a big effect on the ecosystem by eating too many trees or too many certain kinds of plants, or maybe getting angry and killing all the lions. But it's very rare where it can have a natural predator that can take down an adult and a healthy elephant. Then we've got something called decomposers, which we learned about. They don't really fit in this pyramid. Sometimes it's seen below level 1, but basically decomposers consume or help in the recycling of nutrients from all the trophic levels. So they don't really fit in a linear sense because all of it kind of feeds into that. So a big takeaway that I want you to get from this lesson is to know that energy is not recyclable. It kind of just needs to be constantly created. Alternatively, nutrients are recyclable. It's kind of a whole circle of life thing where we keep transferring nutrients throughout the whole food web or food chain. So in this image is a big whole circle of life, you know, Lion King, we're all connected. Well, anyways, energy is made from the sun and the plants using photosynthesis. So plants are being autotrophs using photosynthesis to make their own energy, which then primary consumers can eat the plants, and carnivores eat the herbivores, and eventually everything dies, and when they do, the bacteria and fungi act as decomposers to break it down, releasing nutrients to be absorbed by the plants again, and then those plants are able to have the nutrients they need in addition to solar energy to make more energy to feed more zebras, and the life goes on. So in this you can see that nutrients and minerals are recyclable. It keeps going through. However, you're seeing that heat keeps bouncing off at places throughout this cycle, and that heat is energy being lost. Okay, so energy isn't recyclable. So we know energy cannot be recycled, it must be constantly created or consumed, but the flow of energy is also not very efficient. All right, if you look at the image below, producers produce a lot of energy. Well, by the time the primary consumers eat it, they only get to keep a small percentage of that. And secondary consumers keep an even smaller percentage of that. Tertiary consumers keep a pathetic amount of that. What you're seeing here is something called the 10% rule. So on average, every trophic level you go up, you only get to keep about 10% of it for yourself to be used to grow, repair yourself, etc. The other 90% is lost. We'll talk about what that 90% is, but you can see here that every trophic level you go up, you lose a significant amount of energy. So why is it that we only get to keep 10% of what we consume? Keep as in that 10% gets put into body biomass, like what you use to grow and repair yourself. Well, most of the energy lost, about that 90% that is lost, is due to heat loss, or it's lost by simple body processes. Processes like moving your muscles, or temperature regulation, or digestive tract moving food along. Also, most organisms don't have very efficient digestive tracts, so we tend to excrete usable energy in our waste due to inefficiencies. So when all is said and done and all the energy just to survive is being used, that remaining 10% that's left over can be used to grow and possibly eventually become food for the next trophic level. Okay, so this 10% rule and knowing how inefficient energy moves throughout the trophic level is often used by vegetarians, vegans, flexitarians, etc. as a reason to not eat meat or at least eat less meat. The most efficient way to conserve energy throughout this system is to just eat producers, or again, eat less meat. You get more bang for your buck by eating energy at its source, so eating the producers themselves. You can eat a whole plate of apples and fruits and vegetables for the same calories as a teeny tiny, yet still satisfying McDouble. But the entire plate of fruits and veggies will keep you fuller longer than the burger. It's also got better nutritional value. But being a vegetarian, vegan, or occasionally substituting meat out of your diet is also really good for the environment. So for example, you may have heard of something called the Impossible Burger. They sell them all over the place now, but I think it's pretty comparable to, actual meat, but that's just my opinion. But data shows that just to make one Impossible Burger, it takes 87% less water use, 96% less land use, and 89% less greenhouse gas emissions than it would to just, eat a burger made out of actual beef. And that's because in order to eat a burger made out of actual beef, you need to, plant corn crops and then grow the corn crops and water the corn crops and then harvest the corn crops and transfer that corn to a grain bin and then transfer that grain to a cattle field and feed the cow that you've been watering and feeding and nurturing for months. And then eventually that cow needs to be shipped off to a butcher, taking more oil and gas to transport it, and then it's butchered there, and then more oil and gas is used to transport it to various grocery stores, and then the various grocery stores sell it, and then you take it home in your vehicles to where you eventually eat it. So there's a lot of land use needed, a lot of water use needed, a lot of fossil fuels needed just to get a burger on your plate, where instead you could cut that process a little bit shorter by just growing the crop, transporting the crop, and then buying the crop and transporting it home. It kind of cuts out a lot of the middlemen that take a lot out on the environment, and it also tends to be a lot healthier for your overall being. So again, this is just another visual of how 90% of energy is lost every level you go. You have your primary producers. In this example, they have 20,000 kilocalories, and some of that's lost through heat, but then as the primary consumers eat that, only 10% moves up. So the grasshopper only gets 2,000 kilocalories from those grass, and then when the frog eats the grasshopper, it only gets 200 calories from the grasshopper. And then when the snake eats the frog, then it only gets 20 calories from the frog. And then when the falcon eats the snake, it only gets 2 calories. So it's a huge inefficiency as it goes up the trophic levels. So even though organisms are not efficient at taking energy from trophic levels below it, it is efficient at bioaccumulation. And so what is bioaccumulation? Well, bioaccumulation is the gradual accumulation of substances like mercury or pesticides or other chemicals, and this accumulation increases every time it moves up the food chain. So unlike energy, where it decreases, this one actually increases. So elements like mercury that gets put in the atmosphere by things like power plants end up getting distributed into the ocean and absorbed by green algae and marine plants. Although the tiny animal that eats the algae only stores 10% of the energy, it then stores 100% of the mercury it consumed. So every time we go up that trophic level, we absorb 10% more of that bad material than the last. So main message here is to take seafood advisory seriously. The higher in the food chain you eat, the more toxic it can be. So if you eat little fish, it likely has less mercury in it than if you eat really big fish that eats lots of little fish, and every time it eats that little fish, it just adds a little bit more mercury to its biomass that you end up eating in the tuna. All right, so bioaccumulation is not great. So that was a long detour, but back to food webs. Well, food web is a more realistic model that shows all the possible relationships between trophic levels in an ecosystem. A food web represents a network of interconnected food chains. So instead of just a single linear food chain, there's a bunch of interconnected food chains, and sometimes one organism actually feeds 3 other organisms, not just one. So it's really complicated, but that's okay. It shows us a better image of how the ecosystem works. Trophic levels can also be seen in food webs. So in this image, you still see trophic levels, but they're more complex. Some primary consumers point to many secondary consumers. It isn't just linear, okay? Then, of course, all these organisms would ultimately have arrows drawn back to the decomposers, but that would make a very messy, very hard to read food web. So typically when you see food webs, you don't see those arrows returning back to the decomposers, but that does happen, and that's what allows nutrients to be cycled and recycled throughout the system. So all in all, nature is messy and it's complex, but it's always connected. Certain actions cause reactions within the ecosystems, and today we learned that energy cannot be recycled. It's lost through heat or various bodily functions or excretions throughout the trophic levels. Therefore, it needs to be produced by autotrophs through photosynthesis. Things that photosynthesize are the main base for all of the ecosystems and how they function, but without certain things like matter and nutrients, those organisms would not be able to photosynthesize. So we learned that energy is not recycled, but nutrients can be. Nutrients are a form of matter, and matter can neither be created nor destroyed, and are in constant cycling of being used and recycled. So when something dies, it gets decomposed and its nutrients get put back into the system that plants and grasses and trees can grab to make their own material that then get eaten by other things, and it's a whole circle of life that I keep mentioning over and over again. So your homework for today is a food web and trophic cascade lab. So on your haiku there should be a Google form. It will give you the link and instructions for the lab. That is going to be today's IP. So this should take you no longer than 20 minutes. It took me about 7, so hopefully it won't take you that much longer. But if you have any questions on today's material, or the lab itself, please shoot us an email or respond to the Ed Puzzle question. We also have office hours, but we all hope that you guys are doing well, enjoying the good weather that's been kind of happening. I know it's getting cold at night, but try to get outside, try to breathe, enjoy nature. All right. Have a good evening, guys. Bye.